Hey everyone, welcome back. So, we're still talking about this book today, Think Faster, Talk Smarter. Now, let me ask you a question. When you hear the word framework, what comes to mind? I think for lots of people, it kind of conjures images of this sort of corporate sort of SWOT analysis, or perhaps lines of code in a software project. We tend to compartmentalize frameworks as tools for work, rigid structures that you need to complete tasks to perform your work. But the truth of frameworks is actually far more interesting. We use frameworks in almost every single part of our lives. Most of the time, we don't even realize we're using a framework at the time. So a framework at its core is simply, let's say, a supporting structure. Just like a building relies on the skeletal framework to hold it up, our minds and actually society that we live in rely on invisible structures to support decisions, behaviors, interactions. Without them, we're forced to calculate every action from scratch, which can be paralyzing. So, how can these invisible architectures shape your reality? And how do you recognize them? And if you do recognize them, how does that change how you navigate the world? Let's try and explore some frameworks you didn't know you were using. So let's talk about reducing the mental noise in your heads. This is not me saying this. Scientists have sort of proven or specified that our brains are pattern matching machines. The world is far too complex to process every detail, so we have these mental shortcuts or mental models, or I think the technical word is heuristics. As an example, think about the stop sign. When you're driving, when you see the red stop sign, you don't analyze the geometry or the sign or the reflectivity or the paint. You have a stop sign framework already installed. You see the sign and your cognitive framework reduces your load in your brain, saves you energy, so you can focus on more complex tasks. That's a simple example of a framework that's working all the time and you just don't realize it's there. Another example, social frameworks. Society, interactions, they're built on unwritten agreements that dictate how we treat each other and interact. You might think about the word etiquette in this sense. What is the etiquette for a certain situation? What are the social norms? Social sort of scientists talk about a social contract, what's expected of you? What is the contract that you have with each other? How do you interact with each other? So as an example, you're in a bank, you're in a post office, you're in Starbucks. You're standing in line for a coffee. Now, there's no law of physics that compels you to wait in line for your turn. But in polite society, that queue framework dictates that sort of first come, first served philosophy, and you stand behind and wait. It provides predictability. It reduces conflict. And it's a structure we all agree on. So civilization functions pretty much smoothly on a regular basis. Without that social contract, life would be chaotic. Okay, what about moral frameworks? How do you decide what's right, what's wrong, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable in a split second? You probably have various scenarios or a pre-installed belief system, your ideology. You might call it your values. And your values help you decide what's right and what's wrong. Okay, so whichever values you subscribe to, whichever religious doctrine you use, or whichever moral framework you use to deal with dilemmas, that provides the constraints that help maybe define your identity. Okay, so communication frameworks are just the same, but people shy away from communication frameworks. This is perhaps an area where people resist frameworks the most. There's this common idea that communication frameworks, make you sound robotic. They're inauthentic. It sounds like overly rehearsed. And we tend to equate authentic communication with unstructured talk. I'm not following a plan, I'm being real. Yeah. But the truth is, when someone isn't following a plan or a structured framework, you speak without structure. Your brain has to multitask. You're simultaneously trying to figure out what you're going to say, how to organize the information, and also trying to understand what your listeners are understanding. And this high cognitive load actually makes you less present, less authentic, because you're thinking about so many other different things. So in the book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter, Matt Abrahams, he argues that structure really is actually the key to spontaneity. When you have a framework or when you have scaffolding for your message, you don't have to worry about where you're going to. You know the structure already. And this frees up your mental energy to focus on connecting with your audience more. So a classic example, Abrahams champions the what, so what, now what framework. So what being, what is the idea or the problem? So what? Why does this matter to the audience? Now what? What's the next step? And I suppose by sort of using simple structure like this, you're not memorizing a script. You're using a map or satellite navigation. It doesn't mean you're being robotic. The sat nav just stops you getting lost in your communication. It helps keep you on track. That is where I think the power of communication frameworks really come into their own. So, frameworks are basically universal. They're everywhere in your life. We have dozens of names for them. The right word often depends on the context. So, for example, if you're an architect, okay, you might have a scaffold, the bare bones that support the weight of the design. In your thinking, we sometimes talk about paradigms or lens. People talk about there's a paradigm shift. You've changed the way you think about something. You're changing the framework that you've used to think about something from this one to this one. Paradigm shift. When it comes to doing things, we have systems, protocols. AI uses algorithms, these sort of step-by-step frameworks that help you solve a problem or execute a task and get to the same results. Truthfully, I think structures give us more freedom. So the most common sort of resistance to frameworks is this idea that they limit creativity. Yeah, I totally disagree with that idea. I think frameworks actually provide you with the ability to be more creative within a framework. Let's take an example from this book. He talks in this book about jazz. Maybe Matt Abrahams is a fan of jazz, but not just jazz, freestyle jazz. Yeah. Improv jazz, I think, is the correct phrase for it. So improvised jazz is made up on the spot. But it's improvised, it's very creative, but within a structure, within a framework, the musical framework. Without that musical framework, you couldn't possibly have improvised jazz. The framework makes creativity possible. That's the argument in the book. And I tend to agree with the argument that the framework makes creativity possible. Frameworks make anything and everything possible. And actually, as humans, we like structure. Yeah. So the question isn't whether you're using frameworks. I know you are. The question is, are the frameworks you're using actually serving you in the right ways? So, I don't know, take a look at your life. Where do you feel stuck? It might not be a lack of effort. It might just be that you're trying, to use the analogy of architecture, you might be trying to build a palace on a framework that was designed for a small building. You might just be using the wrong framework if you can't achieve what you're trying to achieve. And I think that is really a critical thing to understand. Frameworks, we need that paradigm shift. We need to think outside of the box, let's say, about the frameworks that we use in our lives. And if we're not achieving what we want to achieve, change your frameworks. Change your frameworks and see if you achieve something better or greater. with a different framework. Okay, so we're going to leave it there. So that is a great takeaway from this book. Frameworks for communication, but frameworks for every part of your life. They are really important, but they are everywhere in your life. Yeah. So embrace frameworks. Yeah. Embrace frameworks in everything you do from now on. Okay. That's it for this week. Next week, we're going to move on to another book.